This is TWiT.
Video games don't cause violence. Or do they? Actually, this is a timely conversation. Brianna Wu just wrote a opinion piece for the Washington Post. And this comes up because after the tragic shootings in, I should start with Gilroy. Although you start going back, you'll go back a long way. But Gilroy and then Dayton, Ohio, and of course, El Paso, Texas. And unfortunately, two things are blamed immediately: video games and mental illness.
Except that they play video games in countries all over the world, and they don't have mass shootings like this.
That's a good point. So Brianna's piece is titled "Video Games Don't Cause Mass Shootings," but, and this is an interesting take on it, gamer culture does encourage hate. And you were, of course, the subject of a lot of hate during Gamergate.
Yeah. I mean, 8chan was literally formed to target me and other industry women. Leo, this is a really serious subject to talk about, but I 3 times over the years have gotten threats from 8chan so serious about conducting a mass shooting, I've had to talk to the FBI about it because I found it extremely credible. One of these was just a few weeks ago. So, this is a very, very, very serious topic. I come from the game industry. I really wish I could sit here and just tell you there's no problems, we're doing great, but it's not the case. And I think when you're seeing repeated mass shootings, planned, executed, manifestos posted on 8chan, I really think it's time for our industry to take a very hard look in the mirror.
I think this is a really interesting take because generally it comes down to, yes, they do, no, they don't. They cause violence, they don't. And of course, there's examples, plenty of examples, right here in this studio of people who play violent video games and are not even angry, let alone slapping anybody. So it obviously, the vast majority of people who play video games are not violent people. But I think your take is unique and interesting, which is the culture of video games is a little, and all it takes is a minute in any game, if you're listening to the back chatter and the taunting, to kind of get this that it is pretty ugly. You don't think that it leads to violence, or do you?
No, I think that our culture somewhere along the way became very fundamentally broken. I didn't get into this in the piece because it was already almost 1,500 words when I turned it in. But I want to take you back in time a little bit. When Xbox Live, the very first generation of Xbox, the one before the 360, we take it for granted now, but it really led the way for online multiplayer and matchmaking in a really seamless way. And the man that was in charge of that at Microsoft, his name was Steptoe. He's a fantastic guy, an industry leader. And when Microsoft was kind of setting the norms for what matchmaking was going to be on the consoles, they took very, very, very aggressive policies for the first generation of it. They had a one strike and you're out policy. They considered reading the terms of service to be your warning. And they actually made the outcomes of bans public for people to go look at. I met with Steptoe and I got to know him a bit before he passed 2 years ago. And he was telling me about all the battles he had with Microsoft behind the scenes. When they moved over to the Xbox 360, they were looking at the human cost of basically looking at all these automation reports and looking at the loss of a player base from banning people for harassing behavior. So they moved to kind of an automated system, and they decided to kind of pit the jerks with the other jerks in games. And we kind of laughed at it at the time, but I believe that one decision really set our industry down a very different path. Because if you look at what started happening on IGN with the comments at that time, if you look at the policies PlayStation adopted and later Steam, there really became an expectation that you could say anything and behave in any way on these platforms. And I feel like today it's gotten to the point where, no, video video games do not directly lead to violence, but it is kind of a chamber where people are so furious that they are amplifying each other. And it's very directly leading to recruitment in these kind of white supremacist chat rooms. And I think we can see it directly leading to school shootings.
Yeah, it's interesting how it starts to become a safe space for hate, right? And this is, in my mind, a problem in a lot of kind of closed communities or communities online that can be a little bit insular. And video games end up building these platforms, not purposefully, obviously, but multiplayer online video games end up building these platforms that can make it a lot easier for people to kind of gather around specific ideas, even if that's kind of a bug, not a feature of the game itself. And I think it's been really interesting to see the debate around this, around 8chan and Reddit and other websites, and it's really problematic, I think, for the companies that build these platforms. Because they still don't know what to do with it, or seem to know what to do with it. They try to build out their trust and safety teams. You have Facebook, another place where hate groups can organize and have organized in safety, trying to figure out how to build algorithms to catch stuff. And it's really, I just think it's really, really tricky, and weirdly, a lot of these tech companies really need to think about just building out their trust and safety teams even further than they already are. And that's expensive. And tech companies don't always want to do that. But it really is becoming a bigger and bigger problem.
Yeah, I mean, you want to be careful because you don't want to get a bunch of old male senators to say, we figured out what the problem is. It's video games. Let's just ban violent video games. All done.
Definitely not.
Yeah,
because there's clearly many causes to this, and you could replace video games with Twitter and YouTube and a bunch of other things, and say, including bad parenting, and I mean you can go on and on and on. There's a lot of reasons this happens.
And so when you start to combine all of those factors together, when you have a confluence of bad parenting, the culture, the games, the social media channels, the means of communication, that all of it starts to amplify.
Yeah,
and that's where the problem
feels like
starts
a modern problem. It feels like something that we have as technologists, but also society as a whole has kind of been going in this direction for some time, and we are now, we've sowed the wind and we're reaping the hurricane. It feels like this is something we've been building up to. But let's talk specifically about games, and then I would like to talk about YouTube and other platforms. Brianna, what should gaming companies be doing differently?
Well, I really, just before I say that, I want to echo what you're saying, Leo. It is unbelievably critical that we don't take this too far. The liberal right to free speech in this country, it is one of our greatest achievements as a culture, and we need to think extremely carefully when we're talking about anything around here. That said, the conclusion I have come to through direct interaction with 8chan for years and years of violent threats is I don't consider them different than ISIS or ISIL, where we do freely take down those sites for recruitment. I do think it's become a haven for terrorists, in my opinion. As far as actions that the game industry needs to do, again, I want to take you back in time. When I was thinking about starting my game studio, there was a podcast on IGN called Girl Fight, where they got some of the best-known women at IGN to basically put a podcast together. It wasn't political. It was just about the games that they liked. When we made Rocket, we actually took the Girl Fight formula and just copied it and made it for wider tech. And in that era, IGN was very unwilling to go through and moderate the comments and ban people for acting in bad faith and basically harassing these women. I think what has happened is we've created a culture where there are no consequences for that kind of behavior. So I think, first of all, across the industry, not just in games, but for game journalist sites and on Reddit, I want to see a lot more investment in the terms of service. If you're threatening to murder someone, that's not a free speech issue. Your account needs to be banned. And I do think that law enforcement needs to look into some of the more serious threats.
There
and
is a
bring
legitimate concern, and we're seeing it already, because 8chan, which Cloudflare pulled the plug on finally last week, and and 2Cows, their domain registrar, pulled the plug on. So everybody went to 08chan.
Right.
And this is part of the problem with this. You ban a Twitter account, they create a new account. You ban somebody on Reddit, they create a new account. It feels like whack-a-mole. It doesn't feel like this is too easy to do. I mean, it seems like a hard thing to shut down. And there's even this larger concern. There's the Motherboard article about 8chan moving to the, and I hate the use of this term, dark web, because it's a silly term. But my fear is you force this underground, then it still goes on. It just goes on underground. That didn't solve anything.
Yeah.
But you don't want them recruiting. Is that the point?
I do think in 8chan's particular case, forcing them to go into, different, again, I also hate that phrase dark web. It does make it harder to access. So I do think it's a step in the direction. We don't have
put it back under that rock. We thought for a long time light would disinfect. That's apparently not the case.
I think saying you cannot operate this kind of website in a reputable company like Cloudflare or Reddit or something like that, I think that's a reasonable step to say. But I just want to stress, Leo, that's not something I say with any joy in my heart. It's a very serious action to take. But again, I had to report to the FBI a credible mass shooting where thousands of people could have been killed just a few weeks ago, Leo, from 8chan.
Right.
I mean, this is serious stuff.
Well, but that's part of the problem is it's impossible to distinguish the serious stuff. Yeah. Clearly, El Paso, Dayton were serious. Yeah. But it's impossible to distinguish the El Paso shooters manifesto on 8chan from a dozen copycats who are just kids in their jammies. I don't know how. I mean, that's when you send out the Secret Service. You send out the FBI and you have them go interview them, I guess. But I also really worry that. So one of the things you're talking about, I take it, is this notion of domestic terrorism and red flagging. And this is a debate that's going on in Congress right now and nationally right now. As it happens, law enforcement, it's difficult for them to red flag an American because of this fear of chilling effect on their First Amendment rights. And so family and friends who are saying, this guy is nuts and has guns and I'm worried, can't necessarily go to the police and say, do something. Is it the case, Brianna, that often the local police can't or won't do anything?
That's just been my experience. I also think you cannot overstate just how poorly prepared local police jurisdictions are to deal with online crimes. Here in Massachusetts, we're relatively well funding. I can tell you our cyber division is much more effective today than it was at the start of Gamergate, but it was a ramp-up process to learn that. These are very difficult problems, Leo, and we don't have one 100% solution, but we have 101% solutions, if that makes sense. We have a lot of little things that we can do to make this better. It's going to be federal laws, it's going to be local laws, it's going to be state laws. But, bullets don't care if you're a Republican or a Democrat. They're going to harm you either way, and we've really got to tackle this.
The other thing is, you talked about red flagging a minute ago. You have to be careful, even if you are going to have law enforcement, go in and investigate these kinds of threats online, you have to be careful about how they do that, because then you end up in situations like these swatting scenarios. Right. And far too often, our police in this country have become way too militarized and way too ready to pull the trigger before actually investigating something. So if we're gonna try to take if we were to take a more aggressive approach to investigating these kinds of threats, at the same time we have to, rein in the law enforcement, and make sure that they're doing it in a responsible way.
Well, and furthermore, I worry about government efforts in general. I mean, it's not too far from that to go to the Chinese social credit system, where suddenly you lose rights and privileges because you're not a good member of society. Or in Turkey now, where they're requiring licenses for streaming broadcasters, including podcasters, before they can make shows. And almost always this is done with the very plausible rationale that, well, we're protecting public safety.
I was thinking about this the other day. Leo, I think your point about asking government to come up with tech solutions, which often gets really tricky, is really interesting. I think, at least in my mind, you could see a scenario where you see more regulation in terms of the government actually stipulating to tech companies, saying you have to spend this % of your revenue on solving this problem. Basically saying you like more of a budgetary measure, like you have to build a division within your company to solve this problem. And I wonder if that would be a way forward in some scenarios. Basically, forcing tech companies to look at this stuff more carefully and leverage resources towards it. I think there's also like an interesting culture conversation happening here. We did on Endless Thread, in the beginning of the summer, we did a big series on vaccines and anti-vaxxers. And what we found on Facebook was really fascinating, because you discover on places like Facebook, which has now actually sort of updated their policy on this stuff. People become more radicalized. There's sort of natural inclination of some of the algorithms that serve the information to people who are not radical at all and are just kind of like curious about X, Y, and Z, is that over and over they get further and further radicalized by the information that the platform serves them up. So I think even at that level, some of these companies have to be thinking more carefully about how they serve information to people who are trying to access information. And I know that that's a little bit different than what we're talking about in terms of the gaming industry, but I feel like there's a broader cultural conversation here about avoiding people becoming radicalized by the information that pops up in front of them when they put in a simple search term. And I think I don't know. I feel like these two things are connected, and
clearly we have a problem.
That we should be thinking about it.
Clearly there's a problem.